Hey everyone! Today we're diving into a surprising truth about the Middle Ages. Most people think that battles, swords, and knights were the deadliest threats of the time, but actually, the food people ate was often more dangerous than war itself. Daily meals carried hidden risks. Kitchens were dirty, water was unsafe, bread could harbor poisonous fungi, meat spoiled quickly, and hygiene was minimal. In this video, we'll calmly explore why eating in medieval Europe was such a risky activity, and why even a simple meal could sometimes be fatal.
Medieval kitchens were often dark, damp, and filled with smoke. Surfaces were rarely cleaned, and pests such as rats, mice, and insects were common. Cooking utensils were shared, washed infrequently, and food was left uncovered for hours. Raw meat and fish were stored together with bread and vegetables, creating perfect conditions for bacteria to thrive. Peasants had very simple kitchens, sometimes only a hearth in one small room, while nobles had larger kitchens with many servants, but hygiene standards were still low by modern standards. Even small mistakes could lead to serious illness. A poorly stored loaf of bread, a piece of meat left too long, or water from a contaminated well could be deadly.
In everyday medieval life, food was prepared in places that lacked even the most basic sanitary rules we expect today. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see, and soot coated the walls and ceilings. Most cooking surfaces were made of wood or stone, which absorbed dirt and became breeding grounds for mold. Large pots and cauldrons were rarely scrubbed properly, and the same knife might be used for raw meat, vegetables, and even to skin animals. The presence of animals roaming freely around households, chickens, pigs, and dogs, made contamination even more likely.
Weather also made kitchens dangerous. In hot seasons, meat could spoil in just a few hours, and without refrigeration, people relied on guesswork rather than safety. In winter, food preservation was limited, and people were forced to eat whatever they could store, even if it tasted questionable. Salt and smoke were used to keep food from rotting, but these methods were far from perfect. Exposure to contaminated food could cause fevers, stomach illnesses, or even death. Even the wealthy, who had access to better tools and larger kitchens, were not safe. Their cooks handled huge amounts of ingredients at once, and cleanliness depended mostly on tradition rather than knowledge of germs. Diseases spread quickly, and kitchens were often the source. The simple act of preparing a meal could become a life-threatening risk.
Safe drinking water was extremely rare. Wells, rivers, and ponds were often contaminated by human and animal waste. Drinking water carried deadly diseases such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. To reduce the risk, people often drank wine or beer, even at breakfast. Wine and beer were safer because alcohol and fermentation killed many harmful microorganisms. In some towns, public water sources were contaminated by nearby slaughterhouses or sewage, making daily hydration a serious risk. Even wealthy households had to rely on filtered or boiled water when possible, but techniques were limited. Water was one of the biggest everyday dangers of medieval life. Cities and villages rarely had a system to protect water from pollution. Rainwater ran through filthy streets, mixing with blood from butchers, waste from animals, and even dead bodies. Wells were not always protected, so contaminated runoff could seep directly into the ground. In crowded towns, people dumped trash and sewage into nearby rivers, which were often the same rivers they used for drinking and washing.
Because of these hazards, alcohol and fermented drinks became a normal part of daily life. Beer was sometimes safer than water, even for children, because the brewing process required boiling. In wealthier households, wine was diluted and drunk throughout the day. Some monasteries and castles developed basic filtration systems using sand or cloth, but they still lacked the scientific understanding of bacteria that we have today. Travelers faced even greater danger. On long journeys, finding clean water was nearly impossible, and drinking from a stream or well could lead to sudden and severe illness. Villagers learned to judge water by taste, clarity, and smell, but these methods were not always reliable. Even rural communities surrounded by nature were not safe. Animals contaminated water sources just as easily as humans. The lack of clean water shaped medieval diets and culture. People brewed weak beer specifically for daily hydration, and many believed water was only for the poor or the desperate. In extreme cases, entire communities fell sick because of one polluted well. Something as simple as a gulp of the wrong water could be fatal, turning a basic necessity of life into a constant danger.
Bread was the staple of medieval diets. Almost everyone ate it daily. Rye bread was particularly common, but it was prone to contamination by a fungus called ergot. Ergot grows in damp conditions and produces toxins that can cause vomiting, convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, or death. Bakers could unknowingly bake contaminated loaves, and families would consume them without warning. Bread that appeared normal could still be poisonous. White bread was often reserved for the wealthy, while peasants ate darker, more contaminated rye bread. Daily consumption meant daily risk.
In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was survival. For many peasants, it made up more than half of their daily calories. Rye was cheap and easy to grow, especially in cold and wet climates, but those same conditions encouraged the growth of ergot. Whole villages could fall ill without understanding why, and outbreaks of poisoning sometimes wiped out entire communities. Symptoms were terrifying: hands and feet turning black, burning sensations in the skin, fits of madness, and even death. People called it Saint Anthony's fire, believing it was a curse or a punishment from God. They had no scientific explanation for the poisoning, so superstitions grew. Many medieval chronicles describe strange behaviors and visions caused by ergot poisoning. Some historians even believe that certain outbreaks of mass hysteria were linked to contaminated bread. Quality control in bread making was limited. Grain was stored in barns open to moisture and insects, and bread was baked in communal ovens without proper inspection. The poor had no choice but to eat whatever bread was available, even if it was stale, moldy, or suspicious. Wealthier households avoided some risks by using wheat, but even white bread wasn't always safe in years of bad harvests.
Meat was highly valued, but extremely risky. Without refrigeration, people relied on salting, smoking, drying, or fermenting to preserve it. Even preserved meat could harbor bacteria or parasites if not handled properly. Fresh meat could spoil within hours, especially in warm months. Poor storage led to foodborne illnesses, sometimes fatal. Hunting and slaughtering animals also carried risks of contamination. Both poor and wealthy families faced potential poisoning. Meat was a luxury for peasants, but an everyday risk for nobles. Many medieval households struggled to control the quality of meat, especially when it came from markets. Butchers sold cuts from sick or dead animals, and there were few rules to prevent this. Flies swarmed around open stalls, and rotten meat was often disguised with spices or strong sauces. Nobles ate more meat than peasants, but more didn't mean safer. Feasts featured large portions of pork, beef, and game that sat out for hours before being served. Parasites in pork and undercooked dishes were a constant threat. Even hunting brought dangers. Animals were dressed in the field, exposed to dirt and germs. Every stage from slaughter to preparation offered a chance for contamination, turning meat from a prized food into one of the most dangerous items in the medieval kitchen. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were expensive and imported from faraway lands. They were used to flavor food and, to some extent, preserve it. Spices slowed spoilage slightly, but were not a complete safeguard. Only nobles and wealthy merchants could afford enough spices to make a difference in safety. The poor had little to no protection and relied on basic preservation methods like salting and smoking. Spices made food more enjoyable, but they could not prevent most foodborne illnesses.
In fact, the social divide over spices was so strong that they became a symbol of status rather than a genuine solution to food safety. Wealthy households often used spices in lavish banquets to show power and sophistication, while common families could only dream of such luxuries. Travelers and merchants wrote about their high value, and even wars were fought to control spice routes. Yet, despite their importance, spices remained only a minor defense against decay. They added flavor and prestige, but the true dangers of medieval food remained everywhere, from spoiled meat to contaminated water, threats that no amount of seasoning could truly fix.
Food and waterborne diseases were common and deadly. Dysentery caused severe diarrhea and dehydration. Typhoid and cholera outbreaks could spread rapidly in villages and towns. Symptoms included vomiting, fever, weakness, and sometimes death. Epidemics were frequent, especially in crowded settlements with poor sanitation. Even minor meals could transmit disease. The mortality rate from contaminated food and water often exceeded casualties from local conflicts or skirmishes.
Poor hygiene and lack of knowledge about germs made the situation even worse. Kitchens, wells, and marketplaces were often breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. People handled food with dirty hands, shared utensils, and stored leftovers in damp, warm conditions.
Food dangers did not spare anyone. Peasants had simple diets, often limited to bread, porridge, and vegetables, along with water that was rarely clean. Nobles ate meat, bread, and wine, but their kitchens were not immune to contamination. Servants, storage conditions, and preparation methods could all introduce disease. Risk was universal, but peasants suffered more from lack of alternatives and resources. Meals were a daily challenge for survival, and careful management of food was essential to avoid illness.
Wars were visible and terrifying, but most people survived skirmishes without injury. Food, however, carried invisible dangers that could strike quietly. Poisoned water, contaminated bread, and spoiled meat claimed countless lives. In villages and towns, death from illness caused by food was more common than death from the battlefield. A single careless meal could be fatal, while many soldiers returned home alive from wars. Survival often depended more on avoiding contaminated meals than on avoiding swords.